Hi, everybody. Welcome to REDF SIF Selection Process Q&A call. Thank you so much for joining us today. On the line and presenting today, we have Natasha McLaughlin, Programs Coordinator, Nicole Simino, Portfolio Director, Jeff Berquist, Portfolio Manager, and myself, Karen Chern, Portfolio Manager. To take care of some housekeeping details, here are a few guidelines for participation today. First and foremost, please use the chat box to send messages and questions. If you have any Q&A issues, please message the administrator and Natasha will help you out. We'll get to questions in a little bit after a brief introductory portion, but we're asking that each person please hold their questions to 2 questions until everyone else has had a chance to ask theirs. And please use the chat box to ask your questions. If you are not at a computer and you are only dialed in, we will reserve a little bit of time to open up the line at the end for verbal questions, but we do prefer all questions be asked over the chat box if at all possible. And the slides will be posted at the end of this webinar at redf.org. And all of the questions that are asked today will be listed on the FAQ document also found at redf.org. We do want to make clear that the questions that we're going to be able to answer today are really going to be about the subgrantee selection process, including overall timeline, letter of intent, evaluation criteria, and other topics as needed. We are assuming that everyone has already read the selection process guideline document, which can be found at redf.org. And we're now opening up a public forum for people to ask questions. We can't guarantee that we have questions or answers to all of your questions, but we will do our best. And if we don't have an immediate answer, we'll make note of the question to look into further, and you can go back and look at the FAQ to see if we answered it later. We have an email address at sif2015@redf.org where you can send the questions at any time, both technical and content related, although we aren't checking that website right now during this call. And we are focusing the questions on content. So if you have specific technical questions related to the application form or any issues like that, please email sif2015@redf.org. Please note that we're not able to answer every single question that comes to us, and we may not be able to immediately answer every question. And we can't answer any questions that are specific only to one particular application. But we will post all the answers to the commonly asked questions. So if you ask a question and you don't think it got answered, it's likely that it's already listed on the FAQ, so please check back there. And if you ask a question that's specifically related to your own group's application, unfortunately we are not able to answer that question. And just to make clear, we're going to be covering detail that is related to the publicly disseminated documents already. So for example, the selection plan or the letter of intent documents. The Q&A conference call sessions, as well as the previously held informational sessions, are all recorded and posted up on the website. So if you don't get a chance to hear some of those, you can definitely go on our website, redf.org, and find the old calls as well as the old PowerPoint decks and view them there. And this is the last forum other than the website or at the email address that you'll be able to ask questions at. We're unable to field any questions that are directly directed towards REDF staff. So again, if you have any questions, please direct them to sif2015@redf.org. This call is being recorded, and again, this recording will be made public after the call. I'm now going to pass it over to my colleague, Jeff, to do a brief overview of the selection process, timing, and criteria.
Thanks, Karen. Two just very quick housekeeping things. One, if everyone could just make sure that their phone is on mute right now, that'd be very helpful, particularly at the end of the call when we open up the phone lines for folks that don't have access to inputting questions into the chat box. And related to that point, please feel free to start inputting questions into the chat box right now. So that we have some stuff in queue, and then we'll get to those as soon as I'm finished with a quick introduction. Anyway, thank you, Karen, for the overview on the housekeeping and guidelines. Just want to spend a few minutes quickly talking about the SIF selection process, timing, criteria, and other information that's going to be very helpful for you when you fill out your application. So first and foremost, please refer to our website at www.redf.org for all publicly disseminated documents. We encourage you to read all documents carefully before applying. So first, before you do anything, please read the SIF Subgrantee Selection Document, Guidance for Applicants, which describes all minimum eligibility requirements, process steps, key dates, and other relevant criteria. Please note that the letter of intent needs to be submitted online. You cannot save your application while in progress, so please refer to the PDF version of the LOI as guidance when crafting your answers. You can find both the link to the online LOI and the PDF LOI on our website. Deadline for submission is September 18th, 2015. That's this Friday at 11:59 p.m. Pacific time. Also, please note that the RFP stage is invite only. Applicants will be notified of their status by September 25th, so there's going to be a very quick turnaround. When reviewing the material on our website, please pay special attention to the following information regarding SIF and federal funding, specifically the sub-grantee match requirements, and second, the use of federal funding since SIF is a federal grant. Lastly, to follow up on what Karen said, if you don't have an opportunity to get your question answered in this form, please send all questions to sif2015@redf.org. One thing to note is we have received a number of questions that are very much applicant specific. We can't answer those. We can refer to the FAQ page. So if there's also a way to phrase your question in a way it might apply to more than one organization, there's a much higher chance of actually getting answered. So before we go into some of the questions that are already in the chat box, I want to call out a couple key things and some questions that have been asked in pretty much every webinar and forum we've had so far. So the first thing to call out is that we are no longer having established as for up to 3 years as one of our minimum criteria. If you downloaded a document right when we first submitted it or made it publicly disseminated, you would have noticed that that was a minimum eligibility criteria, but that is no longer a minimum requirement. So organizations that have under 3 years of operating experience are now eligible to apply. Relatedly, a question we get asked is whether startup social enterprises can apply, or at least organizations that have a startup social enterprise that they would like to execute on. The answer to that in line is yes. Startups are very much eligible to apply. Another question we get frequently is whether certain cities qualified in some priority geographies, or whether organizations are eligible for funding if they don't fit into one of the REDF-defined priority geographies, those being California, the West, the Midwest, and the South. The short answer is yes. Organizations that are not based in priority geographies are absolutely still eligible for funding. The priority geographies are mostly related to REDF's high-touch model, in which basically REDF staff will be coming to your site on a monthly basis to meet and discuss programmatic goals. Ultimately, REDF cares most about building the strongest portfolio. If that includes cities outside the priority geographies, then it's something that we're willing to do. Lastly, there's a question comes up about what sources of revenue or other things are actually eligible for funding. One thing to note is that revenue generated by the social enterprise is eligible for match funding. So in other words, if your social enterprise turns out a lot of revenue, you can use that as the actual match funding requirement and don't need some outside source. Okay, now that we've gone through that, just one more quick plug. You can input questions into the chat box now. We'll be trying to go through those in the order in which they've come in. We also are going to open up the phone lines later in the call, so please, just before then, if everyone could just make sure that their phone is on mute so we don't have kind of some background noise there. So with that, let's jump back into the questions. Okay, so there's a question, do social enterprises need to pay wages to participants for time spent in training? No, you don't need to be paying wages while your transitional employees are in training. What we ask that to be eligible for counting towards jobs, they need to have some on-the-job experience of which they're being paid at or above minimum wage standards. But we totally understand that for most of these groups, there's going to be some training component, whether it's a few weeks to a few months, And during that period, we don't expect transitional employees to be paid, although they can be. Okay. So let's see. So question up top says, would seasonal employment training programs be eligible to apply? So, for example, summer programs. Ultimately, what we're looking at is number of jobs created on an annual basis. If you have a summer program that creates a huge number of jobs, we'd definitely be interested in hearing more about your proposal. So the short answer there is yes, they are still applicable and eligible for funding. But one thing to note is that you will be being compared against typically social enterprises or other programs that operate on an annual basis. So we're going to be looking at creating a number of jobs in a relatively short period of time. So for Susan, if that doesn't adequately answer your question, feel free to submit another one. We can try to give some more guidance there. But yes, the short answer is yes, you are eligible. Okay, let's see. There's a question about, is there an expectation for minimum training, for example, an amount of time or achieving a certificate, some sort of certification? No, there is no expectation for minimum training time. It really does depend on what social enterprise model you have. For some of our groups currently, the training portion is pretty significant. For others, it's quite light. What we're mostly going to be looking at, and this will be teased out much more in the RFP process, we're looking to make sure that your training program and training requirements essentially match up with what you're expecting your transitional employees to do once they're on the job. But there's no actual minimum requirement of time that you need to devote to that. Okay, so we have a question about, does the money that we match with donations, grants, or other means come from the previous fiscal year or the prospective revenue from the year we are applying for the grant? I think the short answer is it can come from either. So if you have some sort of reserve on hand, that's eligible for match. As I mentioned previously, for some groups, the revenue that they actually churn out in their social enterprises in real time is essentially used for their match funding. So you can basically generate your match funding in the current year. We're basically, one thing again we're going to look at in the RFP a lot more is basically your ability to adequately match those funds. So yes, Turner said that
Hi, I think someone just called into our conference line. We're doing a webinar right now. Can you either mute yourself if you're here for the webinar or else hang up and try a different conference line? Did you mute all of us?
No.
Everyone, if you can hear us, just stand by for one more minute while we figure out how to mute and unmute the right people.
Okay. So I'm just going to repeat the last question that was asked just in case it cut out before there was a chance to fully answer. So this question was from Turner Wyatt. The question was, essentially, does the match funding have to come from the prior fiscal year or can it come in the current fiscal year? The answer is either. Your match funding, if you have cash reserves on hand, that's very much eligible. But you can also generate your match funding in the year of your operation. And so, again, that's actually quite typical for a number of the social enterprises that generate a lot of revenue. The revenue they generate that year is end up using as match funding. And the second part of that, which I was saying, is during the RFP, it's a longer application, but one of the things that we test in terms of financial capability is your ability to adequately match your funding. And so that's one thing we'll take into consideration if you're planning on using funds that are generated that year. But the short answer is you may use both. Okay, so question, is there a minimum expectation for the jobs? For example, can they be temporary or do they need to be full-time? Either is fine. One thing, so through SIF, we go through a process of actually defining precisely what number of hours a worker has to work in a given month to be qualified as a job. And so for some of those, we realize it could be a full-time position, some could be a part-time, but either one is very much applicable, just so long as it's going to meet that minimum hourly threshold, which again will be determined through SIF, but at least for this past portfolio, was 32 hours worked over a 4-week period, to give you some sense. So effectively, if you're working 8 hours a day, that's basically 1 out of every 5 days, which is very much a part-time job. So the threshold's fairly low, actually. Okay, let's see. So we have a question. Can you offer any guidance regarding budget range? For example, are you more likely to fund a $100,000 or $1 million request? We've committed to SIF, and this is outlined in the SIF subgrantee selection document, Guidance for Applicants, which I encourage you to download. So the annual grants we're going to be awarding are going to range anywhere from about $100,000 per year to $400,000 per year. $100,000 is very much a hard minimum, so it won't go below that. We don't expect it to go over $400,000. We're expecting somewhere between 18 and 25 portfolio organizations per in our SIF portfolio. And given the amount of funding we're expecting to give out, that's basically how it shakes out with the $100,000 minimum. So in terms of maybe the second part of your question of are you more likely to fund $100,000 or kind of more than that, it's really not the way that we look at it. The funding that we give is roughly commensurate with what your program needs and how many jobs it's going to be creating. And so we fully expect there to be a wide range within our portfolio of number of jobs that are contributed. Okay, so a question from, can grant funds be used to pay wages? Yes, yes, you can use those to pay staff wages either from the social enterprise employees or for the full-time staff operating the enterprise. We go through a fairly intensive budgeting process with each of our groups on an annual basis to set up goals and how the budget is going to be used. I think in general, we have a preference for funding incremental investments into the business, which typically aren't just staff salaries, but I think in all the different groups that we have, and I think pretty consistently, at least some portion of wages are funded by the actual grant. And I think maybe more broadly, that just kind of goes aligned with our broader programmatic goals. We're not trying just to fund steady state operations, but rather actually making incremental investments in the business and getting it to a place where it otherwise couldn't. Okay, so I have a question. So would REDF fund organizations intending to use the funds to hire consultants with expertise in curriculum development and mental health? Yes, we very much would, and we have done so already in our current portfolio. So typically, one of the budget lines we have for each of our different groups is some portion of the budget devoted to consultants or the professional services. REDF does try to do a lot of that stuff in-house, but we also understand that sometimes just paying a consultant outside with external experience is a much more high-leverage way to go about doing it. Okay, so a question from Rick Brown. It's, do all matching funds have to be formally documented at the time of submission of the LOI? No. Short answer there is no. You do not have to have all matching funds documented at the time of submission for the LOI. Again, in the RFP, there is a more detailed section which asks you about kind of funding sources and ability to match, but for the purposes of the LOI, no, you don't have to have those secured or documented in any way. So I've noticed there are no more questions in the chat queue. We'll keep this open for a few more minutes. If you have additional questions, now is a great time to ask. And in a few minutes, we'll also be opening up the phone lines in case there are participants on the call that don't have access to the chat box. And sorry, we see a question, and we'll just kind of wait for another question or two to come in, and then we'll get to that question. So hang tight, Turner. Okay, so question from Turner Wyatt. So for a startup, how will REDF determine whether a social enterprise has ability to match funds with current operating revenue? It's a great question. I think the threshold there would be looking for a match from grants, donations, or other reserves, and likely then look for, if you do want to have revenue from that startup be contributed, that be kind of in year 2 through year 5 of your portfolio. You know, if your plan basically is to only use match funding from that startup, I think there would have to be a very high bar of certainty that you display on the RFP to make us convinced that you'd have the ability to match. Because ultimately, if we fund a group that can't actually adequately match, you know, it's not a good situation. Okay, so question, can match be in kind? No, must be a cash match. Must be cash. Okay, question, so would developing a training institute that becomes a revenue generator be something that REDF funds? It's an interesting question. The short answer I'd give you, and feel free to ask a couple follow-up questions in the chat box, Alex. I think the short answer is probably not. Although we very much would still encourage you to submit an LOI if that's what you'd like to do, so we can understand a bit more about what you envision, and in particular where REDF could plug into that. You know, I think that what we're really going for is funding social enterprises with one part of their mission being very much employment focused. So not only employing folks, but also then paying them an earned wage at or above minimum wage levels. So you know, would be very much interested to hear more about that proposal. Very much encourage you to submit an LOI. But yeah, I think the answer is probably not, just as I understand it right there. Okay, so we just got a comment just in case nothing changes. Okay, so question, how many jobs are expected to be produced per year? Yeah, so it's a good question. So maybe we can kind of break this into a couple components. So REDF has committed to SIF that this portfolio will generate 7,500 jobs over 5 years. So that's effectively the commitment we gave to SIF in exchange for getting the money that we're getting. How that shakes down essentially is we've said that we want somewhere between 18 and 25 organizations in our portfolio, and so somehow between those organizations they need to come up with at least 7,500 jobs. On average, that means that we're expecting each group to contribute somewhere between 375 to 500 jobs in aggregate over 5 years. So that's not on a year-to-year basis, but if you essentially summed up all the jobs created over that 5-year period, it would be somewhere in that range. But of course, that's an average number, and we understand that some groups are actually contributing significantly more than that, and we also expect to have sub-grantees that contribute significantly less than that. So on an average basis, we're saying that we're looking, the bar is essentially somewhere between 75 and 100 jobs per year on average, which is just 375 or 100, 375 to 500 divided by 5. But that's not like a requirement. Some of our organizations are going to be contributing significantly less. We expect to fund, you know, potentially some startups in our organization. We also expect to fund some groups that are very much established. The second thing to call out there, and this is for all groups, is we're not expecting necessarily uniform distribution of jobs created. So we fully understand for some groups there's going to be hockey stick type growth for jobs, or for other maybe more established groups it's going to be a much slower pace of growth, but maybe much more even. The actual trajectory matters less to us than the rationale behind it. And in your LOI narrative, we very much encourage you to comment on why you actually picked the projections you had and why you feel like that's a feasible goal to attain for your social enterprise. So, Janice, if that question doesn't, or if my answer didn't fully get to your question, feel free to submit something else. I'm happy to talk about that further. But yeah, the short answer there is we're committing 7,500 jobs in total to SIF, but we fully expect to have a broad range between our sub-grantees. Okay, let's see. Okay, so question from A.K. Rosenthal. Would you be willing to discuss more specifically typical preferred or allowable uses of funds? Yeah, so there are a couple different categories that we typically see groups budgeting their funds towards. So one was what we called out already, which is social enterprise worker wages or staff wages. So those being either the enterprise director, the supervisors, anything essentially directly related to the social enterprise but not the actual target population. Marketing and business development, technology and systems, any types of employee supports, for example, gas cards, if you need to give your employees gas cards so they can get to work. Any overhead or administration that's applicable. I think overhead in general is going to be it's tough to tease out between the actual social enterprise and the parent organization. So we're really looking at overhead, ideally, from the social enterprise, although we also understand that many groups have federally approved indirect cost rates, which we honor and take into consideration. And then also previously mentioned, we also typically will pay for consultants or some type of professional support services for groups if we feel like it's not a service that REDF can either provide on its own or doesn't have the capacity to at that time. So really, if you look at it, it's basically most parts of a typical cost structure we're okay with. I think in general the preference is for kind of investing in more incremental type gains rather than just paying for steady state services, but it's not a fixed requirement, and it's something that we will talk about with the groups essentially post-decision time. It's not something that we're going to be specifically looking at in the RFP. Okay, so a question about what criteria will you use to measure the feasibility of the growth plan. So one thing I just encourage you to please look at our selection document. There's a lot of criteria. I believe there's, at least in some detail, the criteria is listed out. So I think a couple of things in terms of feasibility. One of them is just current experience with social enterprise. So if we see a startup social enterprise expecting to increase their labor force by 200% per annum over 5 years, we're going to take that a lot less seriously than if it's a group that has a significant amount of experience and is projecting something similar, although even for that'd be pretty heavy. So I think social enterprise experience is one. I think just general alignment, so just understanding kind of what type of gains you're expecting given the type of staff and systems you have devoted towards it. So again, if you have a full-time staff of 2 people and you're looking to kind of shepherd an organization that's kind of employing 200 social enterprise workers, that's going to seem a lot less feasible than, say, if you had 50 full-time equivalents doing the same thing. I think a second or third component is probably timeline. So relating to what I said above or before about the distribution of jobs, just understanding the general trajectory. We don't need straight line growth. We don't need exponential growth. We just need some type of growth that makes sense given what you want to do and where you're going to do it. And I think lastly, another thing that comes into consideration, but definitely gets expanded upon more in the RFP, are questions of industry and geography fit. So what type of industry you're trying to go into, what the general growth prospects or competitive landscape of that industry is. In other words, does your growth projection imply that you need to get 75% of the market or 7.5% of the market? And then relatedly is just what geography you're actually operating in. So, if we know that there's a certain industry that's really high growth in a certain area, we're going to believe much better about those growth projections than if it's an area that we know either has less favorable policies from a government standpoint or some other factor in there related. So, Karen, I'm going to answer one more question, then I'll turn it over to you, and you can take other ones as they come in. Okay. So let's see. So a question. So do permanent staff positions within the social enterprise count towards the total jobs created if they are occupied by participants in the training program who completed the on-the-job portion or were hired by the social enterprise? So I believe they count as one. Yeah. Yeah. So I believe that person counts as one person employed and one positive exit. So for the job component that we're looking at in the LOI, we're looking at persons employed. There's a component of the RFP in which we look at positive exits, which is different. Okay, Karen, I'll turn it over to you. I'll put myself on mute, and we will jump back in, I think, and open up the phone lines in maybe a few minutes in case there are folks that need to ask questions that way.
Great. Thank you so much, Jeff. All right. So we have a question on is there a matching requirement and how much? There is a matching requirement. It is a one-to-one match. So depending on how much money you get from REDF, you are required to be able to match it one-to-one. And again, as Jeff mentioned earlier, it can't be an in-kind match. It needs to be some sort of cash match, but it can be, for example, a private foundation covering the salary of one of the positions at the social enterprise. Like, you can use that as a match. And you can also use other like earned revenue as a match. The one source you can't use as a match is any other federal funding. But there absolutely is a matching requirement, and it is a one-to-one match. There's another question on, according to our definition of social enterprise, can the nonprofit and social enterprise be the same thing, or is the social enterprise another business that you operate that helps provide sustainability to the nonprofit? You can absolutely be a standalone nonprofit or a nonprofit social enterprise, like being one and the same. The model that we've most frequently seen is the model of a nonprofit parent agency that owns and operates a social enterprise that provides programming and financial sustainability to the nonprofit. However, that's not the only thing we're looking at. So if you are a standalone social enterprise that is nonprofit 501c3 status, or a if you're just one and the same, then that's absolutely okay. The only real requirement here is that you are looking to employ people with barriers in paying them a wage, and that you are currently a nonprofit. There's a question on whether or not there's a suggested length for the LOI. I believe there is a maximum word limit that we do request that you stick to, but other than that, we don't have a suggested length of whatever you feel you need to adequately respond to the questions and provide us with a strong sense of what it is you're trying to do and how you're planning on growing your social enterprise, and how feasible it is and why you think it's going to work. That's really, once you convey that, you really don't need to provide too much more than that, but please do stick to the word limits. There's a question on whether or not you need to provide budget information at the LOI stage. You actually don't need to provide any financial documents or budget information when you submit your letter of intent. Our goal with the letter of intent was to make it relatively easy for groups to state their interest in this grant process and tell us a little bit more about their program and their goals for growth. And based on that, you'll be moved to the RFP stage. And it's at the RFP stage that we ask groups to really share more about their organization's budget and financial statements and various financial health aspects. So at this stage, at the LOI stage, you don't need to submit any budget information. And then there's a question around how many organizations we're hoping to invite to the RFP process. We don't actually have a set number. It really is just going to depend on how many applications we get in and how strong they are. We don't have a cutoff number, and so if there's many really strong qualified organizations that we're interested in moving on to the RFP process, we'll move all of those strong qualified organizations to the next step. We're not going to limit it by any pre-planned number. And so, if you're interested in applying, please do submit an LOI. Those are all the questions we've gotten through the chat box so far. I think we will open it up either the phone lines or perhaps wait a few more minutes to see if any more questions come in through the chat box.
Okay, so thanks, Karen. So I think right now we'll open up to the phone lines, but just one quick plug before we do. If everyone could just double check and make sure that their phone is on mute if they're not planning on asking a question, that'd be very helpful. If you do want to ask a question, we're going to be unmuting the phone lines. Please just state your name and the organization that you're representing. We'll then make a list of folks in the order in which they've said that, and then we'll unmute you specifically so you can ask your question. But just for right now, instead of just jumping with your question, just please state your name and the organization that you're representing, and we'll get back to you in the order in which you've submitted.
The conference has been unmuted.
Paul Shelton from Planting Justice. Not a question, just a comment.
All right. Thanks, Paul. We'll get back to you in 1 minute. Anyone besides Paul? Okay, Paul, go ahead.
I just want to say how exciting this program is, and I'm so thrilled that you all have done incredible groundwork making this easy and accessible, and the information that you've provided just makes it so clear. So I just want to thank you. We already have a transitional employment program that we've been operating for 5 years, and we have some matching funds, and it sounds like it might be a great match, and it's just been so easy to read through the materials and get ready to send in the LOI this week. So thanks.
Well, Paul, thank you very much. It's very kind of you to say. And just to reiterate, we're incredibly excited about the portfolio as well. We view the next 5 years as just an amazing opportunity to really prove how effective the social enterprise model can be. And just look forward to seeing the quality of the applications that are coming in. So last chance. Does anyone else have any would like to ask a question? Okay, so I think we're gonna mute the call again, and we'll open up the call bot or the chat box again just for a few minutes. But if we don't have any more questions coming in the chat box, we'll end a little bit early.
The conference has been muted.
Okay, so let's see, a couple more questions coming in. So there's just a question about, just to confirm, essentially whether funds can be used to pay wages. Just to make this crystal clear, yes, you may use grant funds to pay wages. In all of the social enterprises that we fund, there's some component of that, whether it's being paid wages to the actual social enterprise employees or by paying wages of the full-time staff that operate the social enterprise, whether it be the enterprise director, the supervisor, the employment support specialist, what have you. That is very much okay. I think the nuance that we're saying is that in general, we prefer to fund parts of the budget that are more incremental investments rather than just paying for what we kind of consider steady state operations. But the short answer to you is yes, they are still okay to be used towards wages. I know we've gotten a lot of questions on budget. We really do go through a very intensive budgeting process once we've been making awards. So this will happen basically between the February and April timeline. The reason why we're not asking many questions about that on the actual LOI or RFP is because we just understand that the budgeting process is very much a back and forth. And so those will be discussions that we'll have over a number of weeks and essentially being done in conjunction with setting your program goals. For the purposes of the LOI or the RFP, though, what we're looking for is basically what do you want to do and why do you need REDF's help to do it. So AK, I hope that answers your question. Feel free to submit another follow-up if it doesn't. Okay, so there's another question. I think this is very similar to one we just got about percent of LOIs that will move to the RFP stage. The cutoff for us is a quality cutoff. So if we have an incredibly high number of very quality LOIs, there's going to be a significantly more applications moved to the RFP process. Conversely, if we don't feel like there are that many quality LOIs, many fewer will be moved to the RFP stage. So we don't know the percentage and we don't know the number. And of course, the quality bar is also largely determined by a number of different factors. So it's a bit hard to determine up front. Short answer, though, is we encourage everyone to apply to the LOI stage. Hopefully, it's not a terribly heavy lift. The RFP process will certainly be more intensive. And we encourage all groups just to create a little bit of space or time, flexibility, or whatever you want to call it, post-September 25th, because the RFP portion of the application will definitely be a heavier lift than the LOI. Okay. So questions are direct salaries prioritized over subsidized employment opportunities? No, they are not. Again, the actual budgeting process happens separately. It's not really what we're going after in the LOI or the RFP portion of the process. What we're most interested in from you is what growth plan you want or what you expect to do, why you think it's going to be successful, and why it's a good fit for REDF's portfolio. The actual nuts and bolts of what dollar gets spent on what category is going to happen much later, and frankly, it doesn't have much of an impact on your chances of becoming a REDF SIF grantee.
I can answer a question about the funding year. We have a question, just what is the funding year? So it potentially could change, but right now what we're anticipating is that the funding year is going to be the calendar year, which is also REDF's fiscal year, but that the first year of grants will actually be a 9-month award. So we're hoping that grants will begin April 1st, 2016. And that first year would end 12/31/16, so that starting on January 1st, everyone would then be on just a full calendar year of funding. But that would be subject to change. That's our plan right now.
All right, we'll keep the chat box open for another 2 minutes, but if by 10:47 we don't have other questions, we'll end the webinar a little bit early. Okay, maybe just cover this right now. As Karen mentioned up front, we do have a fairly robust frequently asked questions page. There's a lot of information on there. You can find that at redf.org/LOI-FAQs. And if that's hard to remember if you didn't get it, just go to our website at redf.org, click on the banner Apply to Funding, and you'll be able to quickly navigate your way there. We have a number of different categories of questions asked. It's essentially a catalog of all the different questions that have been asked either via email or through the webinars. So if your question, many of the questions you asked today will actually be uploaded on there for others to see, but it's probably worth your while just to browse that list as well, because there may have been questions that other groups have brought up that maybe you haven't thought of that impact your application. So you may also continue to send questions to sif2015@redf.org. We apologize if we've been slow responding to questions that way, but typically we've been trying to get back to them within 5 to 10 business days, and many of the questions are actually already covered on the FAQ page, and so before sending a question to that email, we strongly encourage you to read over the FAQ page just to see if your question is already answered. Okay, a couple more questions in, and then we'll close it out. So a question of, one is how should, one just demonstrate experience in social enterprise if the project is a startup? I mean, I think the short answer is you really can't on some level. experience with social enterprise is one component of our growth plan feasibility assessment. But as I said previously, we have funded startup social enterprises in our current portfolio, and it's very possible that we'll be funding startup social enterprises in our next one. We don't expect, as I said before, we don't expect every group to be contributing 75 jobs per annum. We do expect some bit of a range. And we're very interested in just broader portfolio diversity. So if your startup is an interesting idea in an interesting industry, we're definitely going to look into that. To answer maybe the question maybe a bit differently, what matters a lot more is that we just have transparent and honest information on the LOI and RFP. So I'd really prefer if you don't try to build up experience if you don't have it. What would be much more helpful is just some understanding of, because we don't have this experience, like here's where it would be very helpful to have REDF plug in. Here are the challenges we foresee. Here are the mitigation strategies, et cetera. So just some element of it, like we know that you've thought this through, and it's not going to be basically the impetus or the onus on REDF to basically think through it for you. Okay, so a question, can you speak a bit more about the outcomes you are hoping to achieve in addition of jobs created? Yeah, I think broadly, we're trying to prove how effective the social enterprise model can be, and there are a lot of different components of that. So one is number of jobs created, but there are also a lot of employee-specific outcomes that are also very important to evaluating the overall quality of your program or in terms of the broader evaluation. So one metric that featured prominently in our current portfolio, and we fully expect to be a big one in the upcoming one, is job retention for target employees after they leave your social enterprise. So if your social enterprise, for example, if folks leave your social enterprise, only 5% of them are still employed after a few months, that's a lot less attractive to us than an enterprise that has 50% of employees employed in some position after a certain amount of time. Related to that, another thing we look into is just like how strong is your actual overall program design. So what type of employee supports do you have? What's your training program look like? How much do they align together? To what degree is your social enterprise integrated in your broader organization or parent agency? Like, do we see conflicts there, different missions and directions, or does it seem relatively aligned? So the short answer there again is, jobs created is perhaps the key metric we look at, perhaps because it's the easiest one to look at, and it's what we've committed to SIF, but it's not the only one. And there is much more that goes into actually evaluating whether the evaluation of the social enterprise model is successful than just that. So I guess the biggest other piece of that would be, employee-specific outcomes, something like retention, increase in income, increase in housing, things of that sort. Okay, I think we'll call it off there. We've hit 10:51. Just to reiterate, if you have additional questions, please send those to sif2015@redf.org. We'll do our best to get back to those. But I think the chances of us getting back the next few days, we'll do our best, absolute best to get back to those by Wednesday or Thursday, because we expect a number of folks to be submitting their applications in the next few days. But yeah, please still send it. And I just want to say thank you to everyone for joining the call. It's always very exciting for us to hear the questions that are being asked, because it shows just kind of how much folks are invested in the application process, which is fantastic. Just to call it again, you must submit the LOI online. You can find the form very easily at redf.org. There's also a PDF version of that which you can download and use to craft your answers before actually submitting. And we encourage you to do that because the form, you can't save halfway through. And the deadline for submission is September 18th at 11:59 Pacific. Early submissions are definitely encouraged. We strongly encourage you not to submit right at the very end, because there could be technical difficulties, and we don't want to have a situation in which we have qualified applicants not getting their form sent in on time for that reason. So please get it in as soon as you can. Anyway, with that, just on behalf of Natasha, Nicole, and Karen, just want to again thank you very much for your participation in the call. And if you have other questions, just please don't hesitate to email us. With that, thanks very much. Signing out.